Good morning or good afternoon, folks, depending on where you're joining us from today. You're all very welcome to the SoftCo webinar series. We can see there are still folks that are continuing to trickle in. So we're just going to pause for another 30 to 60 seconds, give everyone the opportunity to dial in and join us, and then we'll kick things off here momentarily. So please just bear with us. Alrighty, just looking at the list here, I think we've got most people logged in here, so we will kick things off. As I said, you're all very welcome to the SoftCo webinar. Thank you very much for dialing in and joining us here today. By way of introduction, my name is Adam McDonough. I am the Vice President of North American Sales for SoftCo. Been with the company now over 10 years. And I'm also delighted to introduce my colleague, Jason Herry, who is certainly the brains behind today's conversation and topic. Jason is one of our senior financial automation consultants and works very closely with me, assisting organizations on their overall AP and procure to pay transformation journeys. Jason, thank you very much for joining us. Delighted to have you here.
Thanks, Adam. Happy to be here.
Great. Alrighty, so what we'll do, we're going to kill our cameras. You don't want to be looking at us and our ugly mugs throughout the duration of today's session. I want to let you focus on the content at hand. Just before we get things underway, so in terms of timing, we plan to keep the webinar about 40, maybe 45 minutes at most. There will be a few polls throughout the course of today's session, and we would encourage you to participate in them. And the reason for that is we can obviously then frame our conversation accordingly based on the results and feedback that you provide to us. We do also want the webinar to be as interactive as possible for all of you joining us as well. And there is a questions tab, which is available to you all on the GoToWebinar control panel, which would have appeared on your screen when you logged into today's session. So for any burning questions along the way, if something's maybe not making sense or we could do a better job of explaining something, do feel free to use that questions tab. Jason and I will keep an eye on that, and we'll either answer questions throughout the course of the session. We'll also hold some time at the end as well to answer some of those questions. And if we don't get to something, or Murphy's Law, you might think of something after the webinar itself, we will follow up with each of you individually as well. So if there's any scenarios or any items that you want to discuss thereafter, one of our team will certainly be in touch with you. To kick things off, what we would like to do is immediately launch a poll for you, just to get some insight in terms of the overall analysis that you may have conducted for your organization. So just trying to get a sense of organizations out there that maybe have done some cost analysis on their overall AP process. So we'll just keep the poll up for another few seconds. If you haven't answered, please do so. And as I said, we can use those results to frame the conversation and maybe to hit on a few key points for you all. Okay, I think that is long enough. I can see there's answers ready to go. So just to maybe share some insights with you and Jason to maybe talk through some of these. So in terms of organizations that have analyzed the cost to process invoices, 11% have said that they've done some sort of analysis already. 32%, so nearly a third of organizations have not done any analysis whatsoever. And then 57% do want to do some analysis and calculate the cost of invoices. And I suppose that's not uncommon based on what we've seen, Jason, elsewhere with other organizations, particularly in a manual environment. It may be very, very hard to dissect and analyze the true cost of your invoice process.
Yeah, it's a lot of times it's until you really dig into the details of your process, even though you, in many cases, of course, you do it every day. So you think you understand all the moving parts, but as we have discovered, a lot of times there are a lot of things going on behind the scenes that many of the people involved in the process don't understand or don't even realize it's happening. So AP may not realize some of the things the business is doing, and vice versa. So certainly something that can be hard to calculate.
Yeah, and even for the 11% who have answered yes that they've done some analysis or um, calculations themselves, there often are kind of, I suppose, apparent costs which may be evident to everyone, but also some hidden costs that maybe those organizations haven't thought about. So hopefully Jason and I can do a good job of maybe shedding some light on some of those maybe more hidden costs that you perhaps haven't used as part of your analysis. So jumping in then to the overall cost of a manual AP function and maybe starting with those that are most apparent. So first and foremost is talking about high processing costs. And simply put, in a manual environment, you're going to have a lot more touch points to process an invoice. And the more touch points you have, obviously, the more expensive and costly that invoice is to process for the business as well. The other thing that's often, I suppose, maybe somewhat overlooked, Jason, and obviously we're dealing with a lot of organizations that perhaps from the pandemic and the shift to remote working and now kind of the hybrid model that we see ourselves facing, they may have invested in some system to automate their process or to deliver an element of automation, and they could be maybe archiving and storage costs of their invoices, or as I mentioned, some system costs. Based on your experience, do you want to maybe share some of the systems and applications that organizations are maybe utilizing today to drive an element of automation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, a lot of times what we see is organizations are using things or have added on functionality to systems such as, SharePoint or Smart Sheets or something along those lines, or maybe a home-built application, maybe a third-party OCR type tool. And then what happens is over the course of time, that system obviously becomes very expensive to manage. They're hosting it potentially on site, or there are cloud cost involved. And then a lot of times when we get involved, we start to analyze that. We start to look at those types of things. And the prospects soon realize that they're only using some of these systems to sort of patch their AP automation process. So there is no real automation. It's just more or less some sort of hand holding going on in this process. And then you start looking at the cost involved with simple hand holding. So it might be annual cost on SharePoint. It might be, internal IT costs to manage that or to back it up or so on and so forth, upgrade that environment over the course of the year or 2 years, whatever it might be. So that is where I see a lot of cost. Many times when companies adopt a real AP automation solution, all of those other costs can go out the window. They start canceling those types of things, and before long, they start to realize that just by simply getting rid of systems that they were sort of using as hand-holding or patchwork, they've now paid for the cost of implementing a brand new AP automation solution that is in fact going to give them real and true automation.
And I think that's a very important point. If we look at those band-aid systems, and potentially there are many that organizations are using, they are expensive. And as you said, you're not actually getting the full benefit and ROI that you had perceived maybe initially when you did select those applications. Other things, Jason, then I think this would probably come as no surprise to organizations, and it is often the 800-pound elephant in the room that everyone is aware of, but we don't really want to talk about or even front up. And that's the increased risk of fraud happening to the business and fraudulent attempts. And we see with introduction of AI, and that's highly beneficial for organizations across the board, but those advancements in technology have allowed organizations and scammers and hackers to become a lot more intelligent in their approaches. And where you've got a manual AP process and AP function where you're relying on human interpretation and vision, there is risk to your business, there is red flags there. And we've seen it time and time again that organizations are coming to us, Jason. Maybe there's some compliance drivers that they failed audits and there's gaps in their process that leave them liable or vulnerable to fraud. It may be actually worst case where someone has been hit by fraud, and even some other items such as detecting kind of duplicate invoices and duplicate payments and that sort of thing. And it's something very, very common that we're seeing across the board, Jason.
Yeah, it's very common, and honestly, in many cases, it's a bit scary, because the level at which some of these fraudsters or hackers or attackers or whatever you want to call them, the level at which they're able to execute some of these fraudulent activities is a bit mind-boggling at times. I personally have been not the victim, but I personally have been kind of on the edge of one of these things, and there was a situation with a small business where the hacker or attacker, if you will, was sending out messages to the customers of a small business, asking them to pay invoices and such from that small business. Needless to say, those invoices weren't actually coming from that business in question, but the customers thought they were, and they all looked real, and many of them were actually starting to go down the road of looking at those invoices and saying, oh, look, they want us to send this to a different location as far as the payment's concerned. So it's something that is very, very, very advanced at this point, and having a system in place that can detect anomalies and that can call out some of these things is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And where you have an AP team that are up against and just trying to keep their head above water and process and pay the invoices on time, that's often where those gaps can occur, and unfortunately where fraudulent payments can be made, and then you're trying to work back and rescue and secure it. The other thing then is really around, I suppose, headcount costs, and maybe they're perceived and apparent headcount costs, Jason, around the AP function themselves. But if you look at an AP process, it is cross-functional. We're obviously talking about business users and people that may be responsible for approving invoices. There's people that may be responding to vendor inquiries and questions and so forth. There's also your purchasing folks involved in the PO process and IT involved as well. All organizations joining us today are working for businesses that have ambition to grow, and that growth is only going to increase the demands on your AP team and subsequently increase the invoice volume that an AP team has to work through. In a manual world, Jason, we see it a lot, CFOs coming to us wanting to invest in an AP solution because they're sick and tired of throwing bodies at an AP process that isn't ultimately delivering on overall perceived benefits. And we know in the market it's very, very hard to hire people. And Jason, we've seen it time and time again. It's very hard to hire AP staff into a business where the AP function is entirely manual.
It certainly is, and I think to your point of CFOs and leadership in many of these organizations, what are they looking at, and what are they looking for, and what are they trying to accomplish? And we all know it's how do we grow the company? How do we do more with less? Or how do we do more with exactly what we have today? So if we acquire a company, if we grow the organization because we landed, whatever, new accounts, new this, new that, new agreements and such, how do we continue to scale with the same amount of people that we have today? Or how do we put those people to better use? How do we get those folks working on more strategic type business goals as opposed to potentially manual data type processes? So that headcount conversation is certainly a big one, and one that specifically leadership is always wanting to talk about.
Yeah. If we look then, Jason, I suppose at some of the inefficiencies that organizations are facing, and maybe just to call out and provide some context here, this is information and metrics that have been aggregated across our client base. So we've obviously worked with organizations coming from a completely manual environment right through to an automated process, and also some prospective organizations as well. And across the board, irrespective of the industry or the volume of invoices, what we have realized is on average it takes about 17.4 days to process an invoice in a manual AP function. And Jason, I know as part of your journey with organizations, you are conducting return on investment and business case analysis with organizations. And there was one extreme example recently where we had a customer, or a prospective customer, should I say, taking quite a considerable length of time to process an invoice. Do you want to maybe share some insight into that particular organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a prospective customer that we had been working with, and talking about solutions and return on investment and all that type of stuff. And as we dug into their process, we quickly realized that they had some extreme examples. Now, on average, that was a mostly non-PO scenario, but on average, it was taking them somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 days, around 20 days to process an invoice. So as you see there, a bit above that 17.4-day average. But then when we dug further into it, we realized there were actually examples where an invoice, as a result of lots of different things, of course, but there was an invoice or invoices that were being processed for over 300 days. There, again, many things going on there, large invoices, discrepancies on the invoice, negotiation going back and forth between the prospect and the vendor, things of that nature. But regardless, when you start to look at those types of invoices and at those types of scenarios, you quickly realize there is a massive cost involved with processing that stuff. So even at the 20-day mark, even at the 17.4-day mark, it's still a very, very expensive process when you really look into how many people have touched that thing, how long has it been sitting with the organization, et cetera, et cetera. So again, that's an extreme example, but they certainly exist.
Yeah, it does. And obviously, to echo what Jason said, 300 days is certainly an extreme example. But again, when we do this daily for organizations, we run through business cases and analysis with them. And one of the key metrics is the time it takes from receipt of invoice right through to payment. And 17, 18 days is average. But Jason, we've seen it across the board. Even organizations, 18 80 touch points, 80 plus days to process an invoice. We've seen organizations taking 90 days to process an invoice. As you start stripping it back and really looking at your more troublesome and complex invoice scenarios and examples, those are the ones that you're going to see actually taking a lot more time than you originally anticipated to process. Just in line with that, Jason, I suppose, in terms of taking time to process an invoice, and a lot of the organizations we would be working with would be heavy PO back. So organizations in the manufacturing world, retail, distribution, food and beverage, and so on, probably anywhere from 70 to 90% of their invoice makeup is a purchase order type of invoices. And this can be very, very hard to decipher in a manual environment and get some real data behind this. And this is often an area where organizations do struggle. But in terms of the average, first time PO match rates, this would be the first time match rate of your invoices exactly matching the purchase order. On average, it's only about 30 or 40% of those invoices that match first time around. So your heavy PO volume, over 60% of those invoices typically have some sort of exception with them to varying different degrees. Jason, based on work that you've done with customers globally, can you maybe shed some light on what those typical exceptions are?
Yeah, I think it's and many of the people on the call here will probably this will probably land pretty well. They see this often, I'm sure, but quantity issues, pricing issues, missing goods receipts, maybe even the purchase order is missing or not created, or for whatever reason has simply not been set up in the system. So lots of different variations as far as what may or may not cause an exception. I think the key to that is being able to manage those exceptions, being able to do something with those exceptions. So when the quantity's off, what are you doing? Do you have tolerances set up? Same goes for pricing. When a goods receipt's missing, what happens? Are there 10 emails that are being sent as a result of that goods receipt being missing? Do you know who to send it to? Maybe you're in a scenario where a goods receipt's missing, and then you have to do an hour of research to figure out who is actually responsible for creating that goods receipt in the system, so that you can then turn around and process that invoice that matches to that purchase order. So those are kind of some of the standard issues as far as exceptions and matching are concerned. And like I said, I'm sure many of the folks on the call here today probably are saying, yeah, we've seen those before. So just a few to mention there.
Yeah, and I again, I suppose to expand on that, in a manual world, managing those exceptions can be very, very cumbersome. There was a recent global manufacturing organization, Jason, that we were working with that received their invoice in. If it was a PO invoice, they were keying it into their ERP system. And in their case, it was an Infor ERP system that they were utilizing. The system would throw out an exception, but it didn't actually highlight to the AP team where that exception actually occurred and what the exception was. So what they were then doing was going off, printing the invoice, so walking over to their printer, gathering the invoice themselves, having it on their desk, and actually going through it line by line with a ruler and highlighter, crossing off what has matched versus what hasn't. And that's the key thing here, is there's a lot of organizations in a manual process that will be dealing with a high degree of exceptions. They're probably not aware of the overall percentage of exceptions they're dealing with. It may be very complex for them to actually decipher and understand what the exception reason is. And then to your point, Jason, how do we handle then and manage that exception? Who does it need to go to, and so on? So very, very inefficient. That increases the touch points for your invoice, directly ties into equating to more cumbersome process in terms of the time it takes to process an invoice. And then that all, Jason, funnels into impacting your close period as well. So the longer obviously it takes to cycle through an invoice, and again, not having data to hand is going to massively increase the time it takes you to close the books. Is there any key areas, Jason, that you see in a manual world that is taking organizations so long to close the books? If we look here, an average of 8.25 days for AP, that's nearly 2 weeks of business work. You're losing half a month, and that's continuous. What are the main reasons and culprits that you've seen?
I think, Jeanette, just to sort of make a kind of a general statement here, I think it is very much related to data and information availability. So in many cases, we see invoices, an invoice process, an invoice intake process, if you will, that is very disjointed. So invoices are being mailed to, business users out in the organization. They're being emailed into different business users. They're being emailed into the AP team. They're sometimes coming in the mail, sitting on someone's desk for 2 weeks. All those types of scenarios cause a situation where when that month end comes and when that month end process shows up, which of course it shows up every 30-ish days, getting everything done in a timely manner so that you can actually account for everything that has happened in that month or in that quarter can be extremely difficult. So I would say missing data in general is probably causing much of this, and not having sort of a central repository or a central point of where did the invoice show up, who sent it, who's it for, did it match, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of it, when was it paid, how was it paid, things of that nature. So yeah, 8.5 days is a lot, but I've also seen situations where it's taking 18 days. So there are again, a bit of an extreme example, but we've seen customers go from, that average of 8-ish days to down to more like 2 days as a result of implementing a system. So just some thoughts there.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on, and I think it really boils down to visibility of invoices. Where is the invoice? Who is it sitting with? What's the value of those invoices? Again, in a manual world, it's very, very hard to understand and pinpoint where the invoice is. And you touched on some of these, Jason. It could be where maybe there's a decentralized receiving process of invoices. So maybe vendors are issuing invoices to different locations and different sites, and AP are completely unaware or in the dark that invoice is actually even sitting in the business. There's other examples where AP maybe received the invoice initially, but pass it out to someone in the business for maybe coding or approval or for exception handling. And it may get passed between multiple different people and multiple different stakeholders. And again, that's AP, it's completely unbeknown to AP. They're unaware of actually where the invoice is. And there was one CFO in a hospital that we work with, that when she came into the organization, that was her biggest challenge, was that visibility of the invoices. And she created what she referred to as, and you'll know this, Jason, her invoice amnesty box. So she had a box outside of her office. It was an anonymous box. Put your invoices in. I don't care how long they're outstanding. I want a clean slate. And that's really, what equates that time that we're talking about, those increased close periods, is if you don't have visibility of your invoices, you're continually chasing your tail. things like your accruals status and accruals reports, that can be finger in the air guesswork. So it's about really ensuring that you've got a complete centralized view of all the invoices in your process. Other things, Jason, maybe just to speed things along a little bit, are some maybe added costs to the business, or maybe even missed revenue opportunities. So some of those circle around early payment discounts. I know on the flip side of that, then we've also got organizations that have been hit with late payment penalties for not paying invoices subject to payment terms. And again, something that we see time and time again.
Yeah, it's the early payment thing is often a hot topic because they're being missed. These terms are in place, but they can't be met as a result of the kind of timely invoice process, or untimely invoice process, I should say. But at the end of the day, I think it's double-edged. It's not only are you missing the discounts, which could be 1-2%, maybe even 3%, who knows. You're also being hit potentially with late payment penalties. So that's another 1 or 2%. So instead of missing that early payment of say 2%, you're also it's doubling itself. You're ending up in a negative of somewhere around 4%, maybe even 5%. So it's kind of one of those hidden costs we talked about earlier. It's not necessarily money going out the door. It's money that could be staying in that you're simply not taking advantage of.
Yeah, massively so. And the final thing then really circles around duplication and or duplicate payments. So what I mean by that is, and again, we referred to this a little bit earlier, Jason, is you can have duplication of resources and tasks associated with invoice. And we see that again in a manual world. Often what happens is the vendor may send an invoice directly to AP, but at the same time may also have an invoice that comes in with the shipment or delivery of items, or maybe they send it to their key contact in the organization as well. Again, if you don't have systems in place to centralize the receipt of those invoices and detect duplicate invoices, you may have multiple people across the business actually processing the same invoice at one point in time. And that can also lead to subsequent duplicate payments as well. And usually you'll see on average in a manual world, it's about 3% of duplicate payments paid each year across different organizations. And Jason, again, it was an extreme example, but I know there was one global apparel retailer that we were working with where that was a big problem for them, that duplication of invoices and subsequent payments.
Yeah, to the tune of about over 750 in the first month that they implemented our solution. Obviously, that 750 or more duplicate payments in a single month, or duplicate invoices in a single month, can add up to a pretty big number. So it's they actually thought our system was broken. So they came back to us and wanted to look at the system and had concerns that the system was broken in some capacity. So anyway, duplicate payments are a real thing, and going back to visibility and lost invoices and invoices sitting on people's desks and things of that nature, it's duplicates are certainly a big deal.
Yeah. And I suppose if we look then at the real impact that a manual AP process has on the overall business operations, and looking at your relationships with your suppliers and with your vendors. And again, Jason, from speaking to our clients across the manufacturing world, the retail sector, if you're not paying those suppliers and vendors on time, that can damage those relationships. The knock-on effect to a manufacturing organization is you may not have access to raw materials for production purposes. That's going to implicate your revenue and capability to churn profit. For retail organizations, it may be the raw material that you need for fashion apparel retailers in particular. And again, that is something that we see, that if organizations in the manual world are not prioritizing and paying those key vendors on time, that can have huge implications, Jason, in terms of the overall running of your business and the overall profitability.
Yeah, if you can't get the products you need to make the products that you are in fact producing, obviously a massive problem. So vendor relationships and paying things on time, or early for that matter, taking advantage of those early payment discounts, making sure that those relationships stay in good standing is huge, specifically in manufacturing.
Yeah. And there was a recent manufacturer we were both talking to that I think their vendor threatened to pull the plug and to cut them off, and that was going to actually cost their business $1.5 million a month. So it can be quite drastic, particularly if you're not focusing and paying attention to those key relationships that you have. Late payment penalties, Jason, we talked about it a little bit. I don't think we need to expand upon it. It is often a grey area. People don't want to admit that there is penalizations in place, but it does happen, particularly in a manual world where it's just taking so long to process your invoices. And that directly ties into supplier relationships and strained supplier relationships in particular. The other thing, Jason, that I know is maybe specific to different organizations or depending on the country of operations is compliance penalties. Can you maybe share some insights into what those compliance obligations are?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is more of this is going to be kind of a regional type compliance discussion, but a lot of places, especially in Europe and in South America as well, there are e-invoicing compliance rules and laws and regulations and such that are coming down. Different countries, different time frames. Germany and Poland and Italy and France and all sorts of different rules and regulations that are being implemented as we speak. So the requirement to send in an invoice sort of to a government system for that, the taxes and such to be validated before then going on to the supplier or to the to the destination of that invoice, whatever it might be. So when you don't comply with these things, you are penalized by a government agency. So this isn't like a late payment penalty on an invoice and you say, forget it, we're not going to pay that late payment because you have a good relationship with the supplier. Not the case here. These compliance penalties are in fact real. You will get a penalty of some sort, and it can be drastic. And this is really applicable to global organizations, but regardless, it's something that can be a very, very big topic as it relates to global organizations. Again, South America, a lot in South America as well as in Europe.
Europe and Asia as well. I know there's obviously mandates across China and India and so on. So it's coming. It's a hot topic. People are talking about e-invoicing all the time. Certain countries are delaying it slightly, but it certainly is an obligation, and you need to make sure that you're ready and set up for success, that you're not being penalized with those penalties. The other thing, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit already, Jason, throughout the course of today's webinar so far, but all of those manual touch points, the delays, the frustrations, the increased month-end close activity that may lead to things like overtime or temporary resources being required to facilitate the overall processing of invoices, that all funnels into strained finance and AP teams. People are frustrated, they're not happy coming into work, they don't feel that they're being valued, they don't feel like they're working on any kind of value-added items within their organization as well. And that we've seen worst case, we've actually seen organizations lose their core AP DNA and key AP personnel to go to competitors that are maybe utilizing more modern automated systems. That's something that we're seeing a lot as CFOs are now kind of prioritizing AP automation as a way to keep their core staff engaged and happy and feeling valued within the organization.
Yeah, it's certainly something we're seeing. And on top of that, we're also seeing the inability to replace people that are leaving, because if you don't have some sort of technology in place, it's getting to the point where AP type staff, they're wanting to work at an organization that has something in place, because as you mentioned, they want to work with higher technology, they want to feel valued, they want to do these types of things. So it's often hard to replace those folks. And in addition to that, this is often a hidden cost. So not only replacing those folks, but also you mentioned overtime. So if you're dealing with an hourly employee and those types of things, suddenly they're working overtime as a result of a bad process or a bad system. Now it's even more cost.
Yeah, and that's certainly driving change. I mean, there's a lot of CFOs that we're dealing with that are coming to us going, I've lost people and I can't hire people purely because these are questions that potential AP employees will ask, is what systems are you utilizing. They want to make sure that they're coming into organizations that are using best of breed and they're going to feel valued doing their work. Reduced financial agility. to me, Jason, this ultimately boils down to not being data driven, and being much more reactive as opposed to being proactive. Can you shed any light on kind of, and maybe expand on what I'm saying there? So what are the typical things that we're seeing organizations face?
I think it goes pretty much back to, it's a very obviously different data, but lack of data, lack of information when it's needed, where it's needed, and by whom it's needed by. So, you know, CFOs, VPs of finance, things of that nature, not having the ability to run a report when they need it. They have to go out. They're opening and updating spreadsheets. They're waiting on the AP team to update a sheet somewhere to let them know what the status of certain things are and such, as opposed to logging into a system, clicking on something, run a report, or logging in and looking at a list of invoices with some sort of calculation, letting them know exactly what the status is, accrual reports, things of that nature, all real time, readily available when you need it and how you need it. So as you mentioned here, being more agile is very important, especially for a growing business.
Yeah, and I think some cost analysis reports and even some overall working capital reports too. You know, how are you paying your vendors? Are you paying them on time? Is there late payment penalties you're facing? How can we eradicate those? Are we paying vendors early? Yes or no? If we are, is there a financial benefit in doing so? So are we getting a discount back? If we're not, then why are we paying them early? Let's hold the cash, or let's maybe renegotiate with that vendor and get some discount terms on the table. So again, I completely agree. It's just having the visibility and insights into understanding where are my bottlenecks, where are my pain points, where can I look at my cost control or cost reduction, and being able to actually have the time then back to take advantage of those measures and what those reports and insights are providing to you. Final thing just to touch on, I suppose, from a real impact perspective, is inability to scale. And we mentioned earlier, organizations joining us today, they do all have ambition to grow. They're in growth mode. A lot of organizations, Jason, that we're dealing with on a daily basis are either growing via M&A, so there's kind of merger and acquisition activity going on. It could be more organic growth, that maybe they're launching new product lines, for example, or maybe they're expanding. So maybe they're moving into new territories or new countries or geographies. All of those aspects are going to ultimately increase the demands on the AP team and increase their volumes. And Jason, I suppose, what's the material impact if you have a manual process in place and your invoice volume increasing? What are the kind of the decision factors here? Is it simply that you hire more people?
Yeah, for the most part, if it's a manual process, and we've touched on the inability to replace people that have left the organization and such. So often, if we just talk about scaling now, oftentimes as you go to scale and as you mentioned, hire more people and look for those folks, you can't often find the need. You can't often find the team to actually fill those roles as a result of no solution, no system, et cetera, et cetera. So just to give one example, we have a customer that we work with today that came to us initially processing somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 invoices a year. They have since scaled over the past 2 or 3 years, and they are now processing well over 600,000 invoices a year, and they had the exact same team. So as we mentioned earlier, do more with less. So the ability to scale with the same team, with the system, have everything in one place. And that's just one example, but it's certainly an important part.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of the crossroads a lot of organizations face is they will get to a point where, shoot, my invoice volume is now at a place where my team can no longer manage that. And do I hire more people, or do I invest in a technology and solution that's going to help me grow and scale, like the client you referred to there, Jason, that trebled their volume without needing to hire additional people? Do have another poll, folks, that we would love to get your insight into, and ultimately what we're looking to do is understand where you are in your overall AP journey. So are you fully manual? Do you have an element of automation that you've introduced to the organization, or are you fully automated? Maybe some of you joining today's session actually have systems in place that are delivering on benefits, and you're happy with them. So we'll just keep that poll up for another few seconds. If you haven't already done so, please do submit a response. We would love to get insight into where you are in your journey, and that will help us on the next couple of topics when we talk about the automated process. I think there's a few responses still outstanding, so give it another few seconds. Please do submit them into us. All right, it looks like we have most people answered. Thank you very much for your insight. And Jason, maybe just to talk through some of those results that are coming back. So 53% of attendees have said that they're fully manual today. So that could be, managing a ton of paper, it could be, saving invoices down on shared network drives and with a lot of touch points. 43% are partially automated. So going back to maybe some of the earlier reference that you had, using some other applications, be it OCR or invoice capture applications, and maybe utilizing SharePoint or some smart sheets or things like that. And then only 4% of organizations are fully automated. So only 4% have achieved full automation and are entirely happy with it. And I suppose if we just touch on the benefits that AP automation can provide to you, first and foremost, it's about digitizing the process for you. So, Jason, maybe to echo some of what you've said already, is having a centralized repository of all your invoices, having a unified process across the board. A lot of organizations joining us here today, are operating across different countries or different regions or different states. You want to make sure that the process you've rolled out is the same across the board, irrespective of where people are sitting. A lot of talk about AI, machine learning, huge buzzwords in the marketplace. Everywhere you look now, there's AI everywhere. We're using it in our daily life. I'm always on ChatGPT and some other AI applications, and it certainly is taking over. But that can deliver a huge amount of efficiencies and cost savings for organizations, particularly around some of the complex nature of PO type of invoices. So, ensuring that you're driving a very high straight through processing or STP rate of invoices, shortening your invoice cycle times. So you're really getting those invoices down to a stage where they're completely touchless or being processed with minimized touch points. And that goes back to eradicating those late payment penalties, paying your invoices on time. So ensuring that suppliers and vendors are kept happy, there's no disruption or interruption to your business, and maybe looking to leverage early payment discounts. So transforming the AP team now to kind of front and center, operating as a profit center for the business, and yielding some revenue savings or revenue streams for the organization. And finally, then it might be around automated payments as well. So looking to leverage automated payments, which in turn can drive rebates back for the organization if you can facilitate card payments. And those can be anywhere from kind of 5 or 6 figures each year, again, offsetting your investment in an AP solution and potentially driving an additional revenue stream for your business as well. Jason, if we look then finally at kind of the real world impact then and ultimately what organizations are achieving, and again, this is across our aggregated client base worldwide, but on average, we know it's about anywhere from $15 to $20 to process an invoice. The overall cost savings for organizations is in around $12 or $14 per invoice. And those cost savings can stack up quite high. So if you're looking at a business that's processing 10,000 invoices a year, that translates to a cost saving of about 120,000 invoices per year. Obviously, the higher up you go, the more volume that you're processing, the more cost savings there are going to be had for the business as well. The other thing, Jason, is maybe just the overall efficiency rate that organizations are gaining. So we mentioned 17.4 days to process an invoice earlier. What are the typical average processing times that our clients are achieving in their automated solution?
Yeah, I think, and I'd have to review the numbers, but the average, I would say most of our clients are seeing is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 days. Obviously, we have some that are lower than that, but I would say the average is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5. And the good news is with a system with an AP automation solution, not only are you going to see the benefit of those lowered number of days, lower touch points, lower costs, all that type of stuff, you'll also have the ability to actually track that. So the ability to see, hey, here's where I started when I went live, and here's where I am today after 3 months, 6 months, a year of being live. The process is working. I can see that the changes we made are in fact working, and here's the proof. So yeah, somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 2.5 days.
And in terms of fraud detection, then, and obviously that there could be many elements in terms of fraud detection. What are the main areas that AP automation is delivering and driving to ensure that you've mitigated your risk of fraud?
So I think duplicate check, number one. That's the most glaring that we see. Second to that is the actual payment process. So duplicate invoices, and then of course duplicate payments. Anomaly detection, somewhere, a good example would be, let's say you often pay a supplier, whatever, $1,000 a month, and then for whatever reason, 1 month shows up and that invoice is now $10,000. So detecting anomalies, obviously that's a very basic example, but having a system, having a solution, an AI-based solution that is going to in fact detect anomalies as large or as small as they might be.
Yeah, so it can look at trends and patterns. I think the other areas as well is where maybe you've a new vendor that you're paying, so you've gone through the onboarding process, vendor's been approved, it's the first time maybe the invoice is being processed. You might want to flag against that to say, hey, AP, this is the first time we're seeing this invoice from the vendor. Are you sure you're happy to pay? Just so you can do initial due diligence to make sure you're happy to pay before you commit to it. Other things as well, Jason, maybe whereby the vendors changed their payment details recently. So again, that can be an area where a banking detail has changed. You might just want to flag that again with the AP team or relevant team to say, hey, payment details have recently changed. Can you validate? Are you happy to pay? Other things we've talked about really around the eradication and elimination of supplier late payment fees, and those can actually stack up quite substantially. So it's usually about anywhere from about 1 to 5% of a penalization on top of the invoice total. And again, it can stack up quite high as you look across the board of your invoices. And on the flip side of that, Jason, it's the uptake in discount secured. So you're never going to take every single discount that's on the table, but we're seeing nearly 40% uptake in discount secured from our client. And there was an organization recently, Jason, that you and I were working with in the food and beverage space, over on the East Coast, and their discount rate was the discount value, sorry, I should say, was about $10,000 a month. So for organizations, this can be quite substantial.
It can definitely be substantial, and many times when we have these conversations, we always ask the question, do you have discount terms set up with your suppliers? And most of the time the answer is yes. And then we follow that up with, are you taking those, or do you have a record of what you've done over the course of 6 months, last year, those discounts, what you've been able to save? And 90% of the time the answer is no, we have no idea.
Yeah.
So it's being able to track that kind of stuff and seeing those types of things. To your comment of $10,000 a month, it can be that, or it can be much larger.
Yeah, it can be. And then again, we've talked about this already, but it's about managing more volume, allowing the business to grow and scale without the need to continually hire additional resources. So investing in a solution which gives you that visibility, gives you that control, allows you to drive the automation rate that you're looking to drive, take advantage of those discounts and revenue yielding opportunities, but also knowing that as your business continues to grow and volume and demands increase on your AP team, that you can do more with the same amount of people. Really is funneling into the overall massive cost savings that we're looking at with organizations. There is one more poll that we would like to run, again, just to get insight into where you folks currently are in your AP journey. So whether you're just starting out and exploring options, maybe you're in the process of evaluating solutions, perhaps you've released an RFP or an RFI, or maybe you've already implemented something, or potentially again, Jason, there's organizations actually looking to replace systems which you touched on earlier, which perhaps are not delivering on perceived promises and value. So we'll just hold it for another couple of seconds. I think most people have already answered this, which is fantastic. We'll just give you another 15 seconds or so. So if you haven't already, please do respond. We'd love to understand where you are. I think most people have answered at this point in time, which is great. Again, folks, thank you very much for your participation. Just to wrap up then, Jason, and to maybe give people a couple of takeaways in terms of how they can start transitioning to an automated AP solution and what that process actually entails. So if we look at it here, first of all, you'd suggest maybe people running analysis and assessment of where they are today?
Absolutely. We talked in the beginning about that sort of the cost to process an invoice, and what does that really mean in your organization? Do a deep dive. Dig as deep as you can possibly dig and get all of the details on what your invoice process looks like. How many touch points do you have? What is that actually costing you? Because once you do that analysis, you're going to quickly see that the next step is going to be much more affordable is the wrong word, but much more cost effective than you may have initially thought.
Yeah, and I think what we'd suggest there, maybe Jason, this is something we're happy to help organizations with in a system, is first of all mapping out the overall invoice lifecycle. So Jason, you're all the time you're in Visio or you're using some other application to map out all the moving parts and touch points for an invoice on its typical journey. And that allows you to look at, what are the touch points, first of all, for my invoice? What's the average turnaround time for me to process an invoice? And then you can directly translate that into the overall cost that it takes to process an invoice. The other thing then, Jason, which you recommend is identifying automation priorities. So is this more so looking at the makeup of your invoices, or what do you exactly mean by automation priorities?
So I think a lot of times what we see as part of that step one, if you will, when you kind of dig deep into your process, a lot of times you quickly discover that, okay, we need to understand what our desired outcome is. And this is where the priorities come in. So, many times you go into it saying, hey, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And then after you really truly understand what's going on behind the scenes, you sort of reassess, you sort of repoint your focus and say, well, we thought we wanted to do this, but now we actually want to do this. And it doesn't, the middle part isn't necessarily different, but your ultimate goal often changes. So identifying what are you truly looking to accomplish, what is the desired outcome, and what does it actually mean for your organization?
Gotcha. So this isn't just broad strokes of, hey, I want to automate my process. It's using the analysis and assessment that you've done to understand, okay, here's my typical invoice makeup. It's PO backed, or it's non-PO, or it's recurring. Here's where my problems actually lie, and then utilizing that to kind of frame the overall priorities and goals of the application. Got it. The other thing maybe, Jason, that we should add here is getting buy-in and stakeholder involvement early. So one of the typical scenarios that we see is an organization will go off and someone in AP or someone in finance will say, oh, hey, we've got a problem in AP. It's taking too long to process an invoice, or it's too manual. We've got to get with modern times. And they will often go off on a journey of education, may involve talking to different vendors, looking at different demonstrations, getting very far actually down the track and down the road with different solutions and providers. And only then at the tail end of the process, maybe start to incorporate different teams. So maybe bringing in IT, bringing in compliance, but they may have overlooked some of their requirements early on. So would you encourage people to get that cross-functional stakeholder involvement earlier in the process?
Yeah, 100%. I think what we often see a lot is, to your point of the stakeholders sometimes aren't involved early enough, things of that nature. But what we also often see a lot is IT. So IT gets brought in sometimes at the later stages because they're not necessarily involved in making the business part of the decision. They don't necessarily understands the wrong word, but they don't really dive deep into what does the AP process look like. So the decision is often made by the AP team, CFO, and the like. But then IT gets involved and says, oh, wait, we can't do that, or we don't have an integration for that, or we need X, Y, and Z, or we don't have bandwidth. All those types of things start to come up, and it often sidetracks the project. delays it, sometimes takes it off the table completely, all those types of things. So yes, stakeholder buy-in and IT and others, whether it's compliance, whoever it might be, get them involved as early as possible.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. You're better off understanding early whether this is something you can do or whether it's something you have to shelve for a period of time. And finally, then, Jason, selecting the right solution may seem very obvious, but I suppose what we mean by that is there's a huge amount of options there. I mentioned earlier, everyone's talking about AI, everyone's talking about machine learning, everyone's talking about RPA. There's a huge amount of choice, and that's great, but it actually can also be quite damaging too. It can be very, very hard to distinguish between the applications. So how would you suggest someone goes about identifying who the right partner is and who the right solution provider is to meet their needs?
For me, it's one really big thing. Well, let's call it two things. The word partner. So it's actually choosing an organization that you feel is going to be a long-term partner, someone that you can count on, someone that you trust, someone that you feel like you actually can lean on in times of need. When you go through M&A activity and you need to add 100,000 invoices a year because you've acquired another company, what does that look like? Can you reach out to them, get suggestions, get recommendations, so on and so forth? That's the big one. And I think the second part of that is finding someone that's willing to stand behind their results. So finding a solution where you can, in fact, before you make that decision, you can, in fact, see the results in the system with your data and actually know, hey, look, they're showing me exactly what it looks like. They're showing me my data. They're showing me the result of my data going through the system with the scenarios that I see on a daily basis. So that partner word is big for me.
Yeah, and I think that proof of concept that you mentioned is crucial, right? We sit in conferences and on panels all day long. We're in the market. Everyone is pitching the same thing. There's a huge amount of claims out there in the marketplace. We have the best this, or we deliver the most efficient process here. There's no better way of actually understanding the overall success and results for your organization than putting those solution providers to the test. And that is something that Gartner would recommend. Give providers your data, give them sample POs, sample invoices, and not just the nice, woolly examples. It's the examples that are causing you headaches, frustrations, the more complex invoice scenarios and vendors that you're dealing with, and put them to the test. Let's see out of the gate what results can they deliver for you and what that automation rate might look like. The final thing I'd maybe mention on that is actually conducting reference calls as well, Jason, and not just letting the solution provider cherry pick the references for you. Actually, you should have your own criteria of the type of organization you want to speak. So maybe it's an organization in your industry with similar invoice volumes. Maybe it's an organization utilizing the same ERP or finance system as you. But again, you should have a choice in that. And one of the things here in SoftCo that we have is all of our clients are referenceable. So we allow our prospective clients to actually select who they want to speak to. And that opens up the ability for you to understand how another organization transitioned to an AP solution, what their implementation process was like, and the overall benefits and ongoing support and customer success engagement that they've had. It's definitely a vital component of any selection process is do speak to customers already using those applications. Alrighty, so we're coming up on the end of our webinar. We did go over, so thank you very much for bearing with us. There is a few questions, Jason, that have funneled into us throughout the course of the session. The first one, and I think you've already answered this, is around a proof of concept. So, can SoftCo utilize my data and let me roll up my sleeves and process invoices? So you've answered that already. Yes, that is something that we can do. We can deliver what we call a personalized in context demonstration for organizations and allow them, Jason, we can allow them to roll up their sleeves and actually test and validate their invoices.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll walk them through that process. We will share a spreadsheet with sort of the data that we need in order to produce that for them. But yeah, certainly something we're happy to do.
Great. There is a question here around, and it goes back to one of the earlier poll questions where people mentioned they do want to conduct calculations or analysis on the cost of their invoice process, and they're asking us here, Jason, can we deliver a more personalized business case and ROI analysis for them based on their current invoice makeup? Is that something that we do and you do daily with organizations?
Yeah, certainly. Building out that business case is obviously important to an AP automation implementation. It needs, I mean, we want you guys to understand that just as much as you want to understand it yourself. So certainly we're happy to get involved with, something we do often. So many times we're able to sort of call out some blind spots and things of that nature. But yeah, we can walk you through that and certainly be part of that process.
Yeah, that's an assessment that we're happy to do free of charge as well. So do let us know if you want us to run that analysis and provide that consultancy services to you. I think irrespective of what way you may opt for an AP solution, it can be very beneficial to have that business case to hand. And again, Jason, it goes back to conversation earlier about getting buy-in and getting adoption. It really starts with assessing where you are today and building out that case. Final question I'm seeing here is around the overall implementation process. And again, Jason, I know there's probably a range here based on solutions that you're opting for, based on integration methods, etc. But can you maybe give a standard implementation range?
Yeah, certainly. On average, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to say 14 weeks. We've obviously done it less than that. We've gone live with several customers in 6 or 8 weeks. It's just a matter of what does the final design look like? What are the final outcomes, if you will, as you mentioned, integration activities, things of that nature. But on average, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to about 14 weeks.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, the implementation is all done via SoftCo employees, so it's not outsourced to any kind of third-party delivery companies or consultants that don't understand the process. Everyone delivering the solution for you is a SoftCo employee. We can also bring in partners. So many of you dialing in and joining us might have noted that we have a global strategic alliance with PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. So we are the preferred AP solution for PwC globally, and they refer us out to their clients. But they also can assist us with the overall implementation process. And the key factor there is that also does not come at any additional cost to you. So it's all rolled up into our fees. Often people see one of the top 4 accountancy firms and they see dollar signs. That's not the case here. So we can bring in PwC to assist with the overall implementation process, change management, and also overall process and solution design that Jason referred to earlier. So that's something else that can be done. And then just on integration, finally, we do have standard certified connectors with many of the leading ERP systems as well, which ultimately reduces project timelines and the overall internal requirements for IT and IT associated costs as well. So I think that is all of our questions. As I said, we have run over time, so thank you very much, folks, for dialing in and joining us. Hopefully you found the session helpful and productive. We will follow up with each of you individually, so one of our team members will be in touch with you after today's webinar. Would encourage you to provide feedback. So if you feel we should have spent more time on a certain topic or covered something in a bit more detail, do let us know. Any feedback is welcome, be it good, bad, or indifferent. And also you may think of things after today's session, as I said earlier, that perhaps you didn't raise during today's call. So if there's any follow-up questions, if you want to see a demo, some of you are looking for us to do some assessment and analysis around business case and ROI, as Jason said, more than happy to do that for you. So we'll be in touch and hopefully talking to you all very, very soon. So thanks, Jason, for joining us. Appreciate your time and your insights. And thank you very much, folks, for being here today.
Thanks, Adam.
See you, Jason. Take care.